never figure, for example, in Melanie Klein's Gothic melodrama of emotional development. Although there are several references in the psychoanalytic literature to the project of a boring patient, and fewer to the seemingly common adult fear of being boring, very little has been written about the child's ordinary experience of being bored, a mood that by definition seems to preclude elaborate description. As any child will tell us, it's just having nothing to do. But moods, of course, are points of view. Clinically, one comes across children unable to be bored, and more often, children unable to be anything else. Repeat. Clinically, one comes across children unable to be bored, and more often, children unable to be anything else. In any discussion of waiting, at least in relation to the child, it makes sense to speak of boredom because the bored child is waiting unconsciously for an experience of anticipation. In ordinary states of boredom, the child returns to the possibility of his own desire. That boredom is actually a precarious process in which a child is, as it were, both waiting for something and looking for something, in which hope is being secretly negotiated, and in this sense, boredom is akin to free-floating attention. In the muffled, sometimes irritable confusion of boredom, a child is reaching for a recurrent sense of emptiness out of which his real desire can crystallize. But to begin with, of course, the child needs the adult to hold, and hold to, the experience. That is, to recognize it as such, rather than to sabotage it by distraction. The child's boredom starts as a regular crisis in the child's developing capacity to be alone in the presence of a mother. In other words, the capacity to be bored can be a developmental achievement for the child. Experiencing a frustrating pause in his usual mobile attention and absorption, the bored child quickly becomes preoccupied by his lack of preoccupation. Not exactly waiting for someone else, he is, as it were, waiting for himself. Neither hopeless nor expectant, neither intent nor resigned, the child is in a dull helplessness of possibility and dismay. In simple terms, the child always has two concurrent, overlapping projects. The project of self-sufficiency, in which use of and need for the other is interpreted by the child as a concession, and a project of mutuality that owns up to dependence. In the banal crisis of boredom, the conflict between the two projects is once again renewed. Is it not, indeed, revealing what the child's boredom evokes in the adults? Heard as a demand, sometimes as an accusation of failure or disappointment, it is rarely agreed to, simply acknowledged. How often, in fact, the child's boredom is met by the most perplexing form of disapproval that the adults wish to distract him, as though the adults have decided that the child's life must be, or be seen to be, endlessly interesting. It is one of the most oppressive demands of adults that the child should be interested, rather than take time to find what interests him. Boredom is integral to the process of taking one's time. Repeat. Boredom is integral to the process of taking one's time. It will be called this forced false self. Being good, in terms of the maternal demand, was having lots of interests. Interests, that is, of a respectable, unembarrassing sort. Nothing that could make him feel awkward and strong. In the course of the treatment, he gradually developed in himself a new capacity, the capacity to be bored. I once suggested to him that being good was a way of stopping people knowing him, to which he agreed but added, quote, "When I'm bored, I don't know myself," unquote. If the bored child cannot sufficiently hold the mood, or use the adult as an unimpinging auxiliary ego, there is a premature flight from uncertainty, the familiar orgy of promiscuous and disappointing engagements that is also, as it were, a trial action in action, a trying things out. At its worst, there is what the adult will come to know from his repertoire of displacements as the simulation of his desire, which in a child often takes the form of a regressive fabrication of need. A boy of 8 referred for being excessively greedy and always bored, quote unquote, said to me in the first session, quote, if I eat everything, I won't have to eat any more, unquote. This could have meant several things, but for him it meant that if he could only eat everything, he would no longer need to be hungry. One magical solution, of course, to the problem of having been tantalized is to have no desire. For this boy, greed was, among other things, an attack on the desiring part of the self, a wish to get to the end of his appetite and finish with it once and for all. Part of the total fantasy of greed is always the attempt to eat up one's own appetite. But for this desolate child, greed was a form of self-cure for a malign boredom that continually placed him on the threshold of an emptiness, a lack that he couldn't bear. An emptiness in which his own idiosyncratic, unconscious desire lurked as a possibility. When I asked him if he was ever lonely, he said that he was, quote, too bored to be lonely, unquote. The child is dependent not only on the mother, but also on his desire. Both can be lost and refound. So perhaps freedom is merely the morning of everyday life. Quote, it is really only because we know so well how to explain it, unquote, Freud said of mourning, quote, that this attitude does not seem to us pathological, unquote. But the child's boredom is a mood that seems to negate the possibility of explanation. It is itself unexplaining, inarticulate, certainly not pathological, but nevertheless somehow unacceptable. Some of the things Freud says in Mourning and Melancholia about the melancholic can easily be said of the bored child. Quote, one feels a loss has occurred, but one cannot see clearly what it is that has been lost, and it is all the more reasonable to suppose that the patient cannot consciously perceive what he has lost either, unquote. What the bored child experiences himself as losing as something to do at the moment in which nothing is invited. Quote, the inhibition of the melancholic seems to us puzzling, unquote, Freud writes, because we cannot see what it is that is absorbing him so entirely. In a sense, the bored child is absorbed by his lack of absorption, and yet he is also preparing for something of which he is unaware, something that will eventually occasion an easy transition or a mild surprise of interest. Quote, in mourning, it is the world that has become poor and empty. In melancholia, it is the ego itself, unquote. And in boredom, we might add, it is both. The brief but intense boredoms of childhood are reactive to no great loss, but are merely an interruption after something and before something else. Like all genuine transitional states, their destination is unclear. Certainly, when bored as an adult, one cannot encourage words or hide the weakness of one's own nature, unquote. But what, we might ask, following Freud's approach in his extraordinary paper, is the work which boredom performed for the child?